Good afternoon. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us online for this fourth session of our 14th annual Global Citizenship Conference. My name is Juerg Steffen and I'm the CEO at Henley Partners, the world's largest residence and citizenship planning firm. The title of today's webinar is Investment Migration and the State of Play in Europe. Citizenship by investment programs have come under increasing scrutiny and criticism recently for the transactional way they grant citizenship. We have all heard about the alleged risks, but how real is the threat? And do these programs seriously present a significant security risk to the EU? Or is there something deeper and more cultural or philosophical at play? With me to discuss these very important and current issues facing the industry is Bruno L'ecuyer, the CEO of the Investment Migration Council, Mark Elsner, Director of Advisory at Oxford Analytica, Lauren Austin, Head of Investment Migration Due Diligence at BDO Consulting in New York, and our UK Director, Paddy Blewer. Mark, good afternoon. Perhaps we can start with you. Oxford Analytica recently completed an assessment for Henley Partners on the risk to the EU from these citizenship by investment programs. What were your key findings, Mark?
Thank you very much, Juerg. So for those of you who don't already know us, Oxford Analytica is an independent provider of analysis and advisory services to companies, governments, and international organizations worldwide. We were founded in 1975. All the work we do aims to be objective. And so in doing the research for this project, we've taken on board the full range of perspectives, including talking to international organizations, NGOs, and companies directly, like Henley Partners working in investment migration. The first point to note is that the risks associated with different citizenship pathways are very hard to determine. There's not much concrete evidence or data. This makes it difficult to compare across different citizenship pathways. So we should all be wary of generalized conclusions based on high-profile individual cases. All EU naturalization pathways are coming under increasing scrutiny. And that includes citizenship by investment programs, but also family migration, ancestry, asylum seekers, and work and study migration. However, of the total number of citizenships granted in the EU each year, citizenship by investment programs represent only 0.1%. And when it comes to CBI programs, the three main areas of concern to the EU are terrorism financing, money laundering, and organized crime. Of these three, terrorism financing probably presents the lowest threat. While CBI applicants could theoretically be terrorists or involved in terrorist financing, there's no evidence of this. The review we did for this project couldn't identify any EU court cases involving such an example. As for money laundering, while there is some risk, it's difficult to judge. Because we're trying to judge the size of something that's designed to remain unknown. However, what we can say is that CBI programs are unlikely to be the source of most of the money laundering in the EU. Even though CBI applicants are usually high net worth individuals, they're not sufficiently numerous in comparison to the scale of money laundering that is likely being committed by low-level or organized crime, for example, related to narcotics, trafficking or extortion. And when it comes to organized crime itself, our judgment is that illicit entry into the EU, for example, using falsified papers, is the main route into the EU for low-level operators. And this obviously is outside of CBI programs. At the same time, CBI programs can be vulnerable to more senior organized crime, so-called managers. But when it comes to the actual business of criminality, that is almost certainly mainly conducted by those who are either native to the EU, who acquire citizenship through residency or marriage or employment, or who come in illicitly, as mentioned. So in conclusion, there is one thing that unifies all of the above risks, and therefore what we could describe as the main risk for the EU from CBI programs. And that's the following. There remain weaknesses in understanding, implementing, and harmonizing national contributions to the EU information collection, sharing, and enforcement platforms. And it's making improvements in this area where we could that could really help to reduce the EU's collective risk from CBI programs, as just detailed.
Thank you, Mark. This is very interesting indeed. Laura, as head of Investment Migration Due Diligence at BDO, perhaps it would be useful at this point to talk us through what due diligence is currently in place and how this compares to that done on other international investment products and industries, and what could be done to enhance the level of investigation/security.
Thank you, Juerg. So as we know, due diligence plays a really critical role within investment migration, but still to this day, I think there remains a lack of consistency and standardization across programs. When you look at the current state of things, you'll see that many programs have implemented robust due diligence frameworks, while there are others that have virtually no process in place for due diligence, or do just the most basic of sanctions and watch list screening. Despite the uneven application, we have seen strides made towards a more consistent application, which is a very hopeful thing for us in the due diligence industry. And I would say a number of government programs, mainly CBI and less so the RBI programs, are currently following many, if not all, of the recommended best practices for due diligence. So I'll just run through those really quick. It's a 5-step process, and you'll see that most, a good portion, I wouldn't say most, but a good portion of your citizenship by investment programs are following the step of KYC first, where they identify and verify the applicants. Then a legal clearance, where they're looking to other police authorities and conducting searches of Interpol, Europol. Third, their teams are internally taking a look at all of the documentation, looking for red flags, looking for anomalies. They're then outsourcing to third-party providers such as BDO to conduct deep dive due diligence, where we're doing things like verifying self-disclosed information, but also digging into the applicant's source of wealth, their network, their political connections, reputational issues, things of this nature. And then finally, they're taking all of that information, and the programs sit down with the amassed information, and they do an evaluation based on a risk framework. And this risk framework is consistent and comprehensive, and allows them to make consistent decisions across the board without any sort of pressure from outside forces. Even though there's a number of programs that do follow this, there's a lack of transparency when it comes to the process and the procedures that they take. I would say this type of due diligence greatly exceeds that's being done for other industries. But truly, there are a number of programs that still lack, and especially the European Golden Visa programs, that really could stand to step up their due diligence beyond just minor verifications and criminal history checks. When it comes to enhancements, certainly I think, in addition to the residence programs, there's also a gap in due diligence that remains with a significant portion of our industry, and that's really the agents that represent applicants. Despite the ultimate decision being in the government's hands, agents really do act as a first line of defense, especially if the applicants are being submitted to programs that have less than robust due diligence. The recommended due diligence is very similar for agents as it is compared to the government programs, to an obvious lesser degree, but very much includes the KYC screening, a risk assessment, and enhanced due diligence if needed, based on the level of risk of the applicant. So I think, while the government standards are a little bit more difficult to enforce, the agent-based standards can be regulated by government programs within which the agents work. It's not just doable, but I think it's very advisable for the good of the industry. And the other enhancement I'll briefly mention is the concept of continuous monitoring, or post-decision monitoring, which we also call it. As due diligence is really only capturing just the past and present behavior of an applicant, a solution that can continue to monitor their behavior after a decision is made, passport's been issued, it very much allows for a level of security that doesn't exist based on just a one-time due diligence investigation. This is just another way I think that we could protect the credibility of the programs and the industry as a whole, and it would be a good thing for governments to enforce. But overall, current state, not perfect, but we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Laura. Bruno, as CEO of the Investment Migration Council, our industry body, you have been involved in efforts to promote the deeper understanding of our industry in Brussels and beyond, as well as establish a high level of professional conduct amongst practitioners. As we heard before, as Mark has pointed out, one of the key risks for the EU from investment migration programs appears to come from the interaction of uneven systems within the bloc. Is this your assessment, or are there other dynamics at place inherent to the EU consideration of CBI that we in the industry need to better understand?
Hello, Juerg. It's very nice to see you, and thank you very much for the kind invitation.
You're welcome.
And secondly, congratulations. I've recently received the reports by Mark's office at Oxford Analytica. I haven't had time to read it in its entirety, but the executive summary is certainly a step in the right direction in terms of publishing EU risk assessments surrounding citizenship and residency by investment, and also very timely given the events of the last few weeks. But look, investment migration is a $2 billion industry. It's responsible for significant investment, job creation, and societal development. It accounts for billions of direct and indirect revenues in some smaller sovereign states. However, as has been mentioned, there are currently no established global standards for investment migration. And setting such standards has always been of exceptional importance for the Investment Migration Council's community of nearly 500 members in 54 different countries. So while having a clear and coherent framework is now probably more important than ever, there are at least two reasons for that. So firstly, all the involved parties should follow a set of harmonized and well-established rules which would contribute to better compliance with global financial regulation. And secondly, having global standards would contribute to an improved understanding of the investment migration sector, which, as we know, is a legal migration pathway. And that would then improve trust in this sector by the outside world. So the lack of global standards and good understanding of both citizenship and residency program may not only be confusing, but also a source of distrust towards the entire industry. So as we know, money is a very sensitive topic. And then when you bring that into connection with citizenship, which is perceived by many as something which essentially money shouldn't buy, but also with wealthy individuals who, unlike many of us, can afford to pick and choose their nationality, the investment migration industry is easily and yet unfairly stigmatized. So we know that there are a number of studies that testify that an enhanced transparency regime and a better regulatory framework for the industry would mark a definite significant development in addressing a lot of the concerns related to investment migration programs. So I hope you're all still with me here. So let's look at well-designed investment migration programs. These generally would imply that the interests of the clients and those of the governments are essentially aligned. And this is usually where the key issues usually arise. So plenty of mistakes can be made which undermine the interests of both the government and the clients. So for example, due diligence requirements by governments that are eager to cash in on programs could be a little bit too lenient. While this can be presented as a positive feature, since a visa or nationality is easier to acquire, it's actually highly problematic in the longer run. So when you have such leniency that is discovered, it then undermines the trust of other states in the nationalities that are granted, which reduces the value of investments for all clients, and then ultimately it undermines the financial viability of a program. So then similarly, programs that lack transparency or, if you like, where the rules are not sufficiently clear and strict, that can also open the doors to corruption. And then that ultimately undermines the trust and the value of the investments. Now, I know we don't have a lot of time, but let me finish in a couple of minutes. On the other side of the coin, the attractiveness of most diligently produced and designed programs can be radically different from real life. We have a number of studies that show that the added value for some reputable programs is very far from clear at the moment, as the investments they generate are not providing sufficient added value for the country's economies in order to justify the levels of resources that are then required to run the programs. So all in all, very serious individual scrutiny of the components of each resident and citizenship by investment program is required before any conclusions can be drawn. And I bring in any conclusions that the European Commission may be making in the next few months, any conclusions that the OECD may be making, the Council of Europe, and other institutional bodies that should be looking at regulating citizenship and residency by investment programs rather than point blank shutting them down.
We talked many times about these points, and of course we completely agree. So thank you, Bruno. Finally, I would like to bring in Henley Partners UK Director Paddy Blewer, who is a specialist in capital markets and geopolitics and has advised numerous sovereign states. Paddy, good afternoon. How do you respond to Mark's points that also investment migration programs pose an indirect risk of money laundering? They are actually unlikely to constitute a significant security threat to the EU.
Afternoon, Juerg. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to have a quick chat on this.
Welcome.
Look, I think this is a really interesting area of research. 20-something years ago, I was a counterinsurgency analyst for the British government, particularly investigating the uses of how intelligence can fight against insurgencies. Something that was apparent then and is apparent now is that the bad guys, the guys that we should all be scared of, we share the concerns of the European Union, do not look to use legal pathways to do illegal things, because everyone's heard of the Al Capone story. The reason they got him wasn't for being a bootlegger, wasn't for murder, wasn't for assault, wasn't for any of the violent crimes that you can see on the great film from the 80s, The Untouchables. It was because he didn't pay his taxes and he lived like a millionaire and he was on a list. And at the heart of it, that's why I believe that one of the really interesting things I'd like to develop a little bit more is that I see the fear of the unknown becoming the lingua franca of a certain community. And they're building on the fear of the unknown rather than working with organizations like Oxford Analytica or the Investment Migration Council to really understand the reality of our industry, and then to build effective defenses against any potential risks. I thought it was great hearing Laura's comments about the efficacy of professional due diligence and what can be done to improve across resident citizenship and across the agents. I think it's vital that we're always looking to improve this, because it really reminds me of the other time in my life as I was an investment banker. I used to be a foreign exchange trader, and I used to work with guys that had done 30 years, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the stories they used to tell about institutional foreign exchange in the 70s and 80s shocked kids like me back then, because regulation had come in. And what had been the Wild West of investment banking had been tamed and had been made safe. And it's exactly as Bruno has just said, is that the way forward, I think, for citizenship by investment, residence by investment, is an effective agreement standards where multiple communities come together to agree the standards and then look to apply effective global regulation. Because this is how sovereign states remain sovereign. This is how global mobility can create significant sovereign and societal value. And also we can all be part of a more prosperous world through interconnections and global commerce. And that, I think this is really where I'd like to focus on, is the fear of the unknown and how we all as an industry can work together to help educate groups of stakeholders, different audiences, to demonstrate that we share their concerns. We share their concerns over various different potential risks. And already with professionals like Laura, with professionals like Bruno, with professionals like Mark, and God forbid, professionals like myself, we take this seriously enough to put in place an integrated structure of defense that already acts as a very powerful deterrent to any of the bad guys that would wish to penetrate it, to the point where they don't try. As Mark says, they look at alternative methods of residence or citizenship because our channels are already very well policed. This is not to say there isn't room for improvement. There is room for improvement in virtually every industry, and citizenship by investment, being such a new industry, can certainly continually evolve and improve. But I'd like to talk more in the coming weeks and months ahead about what I believe to be some fundamental misconceptions and how we can work positively together to educate and engage what are at the moment quite critical audiences, demonstrate the value that we create, and demonstrate how entirely committed we are to risk identification, risk management, and risk avoidance. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Paddy, Bruno, Laura, and Mark. This was a really worthwhile and interesting discussion, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you to all our online guests as well who have joined us today. We appreciate your interest and engagement in these important issues facing our industry. Please join us again next week for the next session of our 14th Annual Global Citizenship Conference, which will focus on real estate-linked investment migration as a portfolio diversification option for high net worth families. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.